And it's this assumption that all God wants me to do is go to church. All God wants me to do is to go to church. Now, I was raised that way, and some of you were raised in the church and around the church. Some of you would look on the outside and say, the only thing church people ever asked me to do is go to church with them. And it's what locks in this assumption. So some of you were raised going to church. And so you go 3-4 times a year, Easter, Christmas, faux show, or maybe Mother's Day kind of a thing, and you would go to church here and there. A bunch of us were raised like that. Some of us were raised in church. That's a big distinction in the church world. I was raised in church. So what that meant was that I was in church all the time. So we would go Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night at a minimum, and then usually a fourth night for something, and then our social life revolved around the church. And so my life was engrossed in the church, right? And some of you weren't raised around the church at all, but that's the only thing you knew about God, is people would look at you and say, you need to get to church. You better get those kids in church. If you want to save your marriage, you better start going to church, right? And so we get that idea out there all the time. I was raised like that. And when I was growing up, my church, you didn't miss church. You did not. It was like a mortal sin to miss church. And there's only about 60 or 70 of us. So if you missed church, everybody knew. And they would ask you, where were you? I didn't see you last week in church. Right? And I noticed you weren't in church last week. And they would kind of ask you those questions. And if you didn't have an answer, if you weren't like coughing up blood or something, like then you had no excuse to miss church. We would go to church on Super Bowl Sunday. You had to miss the Super Bowl game. You had to turn it off halfway through and go to church. And that was before VCRs. You just had to miss it, right? And so you would just miss it because the shallow people canceled church for football. The committed people went to church despite whatever was going on with football. And that's just kind of the way that it works. We used to have this thing in my church growing up called sunrise service. I don't know if any of you had this growing up. Sunrise service is perhaps the most horrible thing ever invented from Satan. And so this was sunrise service. Sunrise service was a church service before church service on Easter Sunday, but you sat outside and you waited for the sun to rise. It was horrible. I hated it, right? And I was a paper boy growing up. Now, let me explain what a paper was. They used to print the internet, and they put it on a paper, and then you would put it in people's houses so you guys know. But that's what would happen. I was a paper boy, and then they would employ child labor to deliver the internet to people. And so I was a paper boy, and I had the Sunday route, and the Sunday papers used to be like mammoth, especially Easter Sunday was like mammoth, right? So I had to deliver my papers before sunrise service, which was before church on Easter. So my poor sister, Susan, would get up. She had her driver's license. She would drive me around the neighborhood at 4 o'clock in the morning so I could deliver my papers, so I could go to sunrise service, so I could have blood loss and skin damage on my rear end from sitting on metal folding chairs in sub-zero temperatures, because Jesus rose again from the dead, right? And somehow that was what you did on sunrise service, right? And then you would come in and you would eat breakfast, and then you'd have church. And it was always something like that. New Year's Eve, we had watch night service. You had to watch for the rapture every New Year's Eve, see if Jesus was going to come back at 12:01, right? And so it was all the time, church, 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 church. And if you missed it, then you weren't committed to Christ. And if you didn't go, or it didn't work out, or you had something else going on in your life, then you weren't committed to Christ, and you weren't committed to these people. And many of us have that type of assumption, that that's what God wants. What happened for me then, as I became a teenager, and then especially into college, is I just started, because I was taught that kind of directly and then subtly, like you pick up those cues when you grow up in that culture. I was taught that if you didn't go to church, then you were in a deficit with God. So as I grew up, my faith never left the building with me. I was not a follower of Christ, but I would go to church. And I would go out in college, and I would wake up wherever with whoever and whatever level of sobriety I happened to be in, and I would go to church that Sunday morning, because the thought was this: I had run up a credit card with God, and now I have to pay it off. And if I don't get to church and pay it off, I'm going to like lose my job and lose my house and go bald. You know what I mean? And so I'm just going to like move all that, but I got to get to church in order to stay right with God, because that's what God wants. And so that assumption locks in. That's what God wants. He wants me to come to a meeting and sit through it and endure it and do some rituals and do some routines and drop a little coin in the basket, and that's going to please him. And I want to argue a little bit that is a false assumption about the heart and the mind of God.